All right, so the next talk, we're going to stick with Bloater and Cisco. We've got Josh Egan from GLFC, who will be able to provide his presentation. There you go.
Perfect.
Enjoy.
Just left and right. Is that working?
Yeah.
Perfect. Cool. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Josh Egan from the Great Lakes Fishery Commission. Stand over here. Today I'm going to be talking about some work that was done in the fall of 2024 to delineate so-called spatial units for Lake Ontario, Cisco, and Bloater. So Bloater and Cisco were historically very abundant in Lake Ontario. They supported large fisheries and diverse assemblages of predatory fish in the offshore pelagic zone of the lake. However, abundances of both species have declined dramatically. Cisco still exists in the lake. However, Bloater appeared to be entirely extirpated. The last wild individual was caught in 1983. And this figure from Weidel et al. Nicely provides an index of Cisco abundance over the last 75-ish years, with the gray shaded circles showing catches in the province of Ontario, and the unshaded or open circles showing time series data for New York waters. And then I should mention that the y-axis is harvest in thousands of kilograms. So there is interest in restoring both of these species to support fisheries as well as communities of predatory fish. However, there are a lot of unanswered questions about these taxa as well as their habitats that impedes restoration efforts. And so as a result, the Lake Ontario Committee requested application of this Corgonin restoration framework, which Brian actually just mentioned in his previous talk, to Cisco and Bloater in Lake Ontario. And this is a multi-phased framework with planning, restoration, and evaluation phases, each with multiple steps. And the hope is that this framework will provide a set of powerful tools to aid managers with restoration efforts throughout the Great Lakes Basin. Today, during my talk, I'm just focusing on this first spatial unit delineation step. This is a data-driven step that also leverages the expertise of fishery managers and biologists to delineate spatial units in order to answer questions about historical and contemporary population structure. So, to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, so the objective of spatial units is to describe the areas inhabited by both extant populations of the focal species as well as extirpated or extinct populations. And spatial units are defined by reproductive habitat alone that is associated with a population. And this is done for matters both of practicality, but also because reproductive habitat is critical to population viability. So for example, if in your focal area, in this case Lake Ontario, if you identify 3 populations, you would then have 3 spatial units that are bounded by the reproductive habitat associated with those populations. There are 2 unit types that are important to today's talk. First off, occupied units, which you may be able to guess from the name, apply to the reproductive habitat of extant populations. And then we also have unoccupied spatial units, which describe the reproductive habitat of extirpated populations that used to occur in the area that no longer do. And then one final thing to keep in mind is that this method applies to wild fish, not stocked fish. So that's important to keep in mind for Bloater, which are stocked but are not thought to reproduce naturally in Lake Ontario. Spatial units are delineated through a 4-step process. So the first step involves assembling an expert panel. The idea is that this panel would represent diverse perspectives and institutions. Next, workshop facilitators do a thorough data synthesis, synthesizing relevant data from things like reports, published papers, databases, museum records, and even unpublished data that's shared with us by the expert panel members. So step 3, we have a meeting, and in this meeting, the workshop facilitators present a preliminary data synthesis to the expert panel. The expert panel uses this information to come up with a set of spatial unit hypotheses based on this information that is then formally tested in the next step. And this set of hypotheses can vary both in terms of unit boundaries as well as numbers of spatial units. And then finally, the spatial unit assessment itself. So during this assessment, a revised data synthesis is presented that's tailored to the specific hypotheses that the expert panel came up with. The expert panel then uses this information, and through a somewhat laborious scoring process, they determine which hypothesis is best supported by the data. And I won't get into the details of the expert elicitation methodology here today. If you have questions, feel free to visit this Great Lakes Cisco's website, or just shoot me an email or corner me after my presentation, and I'd be happy to talk about it. Yeah, let's see. There we go. All right, so moving on to results. I'm going to primarily focus on Cisco just because I've only got 15 minutes today. I'll briefly mention the Bloater results. There is a full report that's going to result from all this work that has much more detail than I'm going to talk about today. So stay tuned for that, or again, just talk to me if you're curious about more detail. So first off, I'll take the opportunity to thank our expert panel, without which this work would not be possible. There's a little bit of a typo here. This should say 15 members. We added 2 at the last minute, Amanda Akis from USGS and Caitlin King from the University of Michigan. So apologies for that. So we ended up with 15 members. We had folks from academia, provincial, state, and federal governments, and from a lot of different backgrounds, which was really helpful. Excuse me. All right, so there's quite a few components to this figure. Hopefully you can see the lines on these projectors. I'll walk you through each component, and if something's unclear, feel free to just stop me and I can explain it. So one unoccupied unit was delineated for Cisco, and this is because there were substantial amounts of space within Lake Ontario that were thought to have historically supported reproduction that no longer do so. Only one unit was delineated because there was no substantial evidence of reproductive isolation within different areas of this unoccupied space, which would have been required to delineate multiple units. So moving on to the figure. The black lines, which hopefully you can somewhat see, constrain or are the boundaries of the unit itself. Overlaying on these boundaries or on this space is a reproductive habitat suitability model. So this is represented by a heat map with warmer colors representing more suitable reproductive or spawning habitat. And we incorporated this model just to add greater nuance and resolution to these spatial units rather than just having coarse boundaries. This is an unpublished model that was developed by Caitlin King and her team as part of another step in this restoration framework. And I won't go into details, but if you're curious, let me know, and there's quite a bit that went on to come up with this model. In this case, this is a historical model, since we're talking about unoccupied units, and it's based upon spawning data and environmental variables. Additionally, you'll see gray space within the lake. That is space that is outside the depth range imposed by the expert panel for spatial units. So for Cisco, they imposed a depth range of 0 to 55 meters based upon what we know about where Cisco reproduce. And conveniently, in Brian's talk, he just explained this figure, so I'll just briefly recap. Open shapes, no Cisco larvae were caught. Circles, both size and darkness, correspond to places where Cisco larvae were collected, with the darker, larger circles indicating greater Cisco larval densities. So this is just, I should have prefaced this by saying this is just one example of the type of data that was considered when delineating spatial units. I don't have time to get into all the data, but I just wanted to provide an example of what sort of information the expert panel was reviewing. And as you'll notice, there were 3 areas where there are quite a few Cisco caught, as well as a substantial amount of space where Cisco larvae were not found. And so this was highly influential for the expert panel when determining where spatial unit boundaries should be drawn. Okay, now thinking about current times, we have 2 occupied Cisco spatial units. This figure is set up just like the last one, but in this case we have a contemporary reproductive habitat suitability model rather than a historical model. Likewise, just like the previous figure, we have a depth range of 0 to 55 meters, so the grayed out areas are not within spatial units. The black lines, which are a little, see does this work? Yeah, black lines, which are a little tough to see, show the spatial unit boundaries. I have boxes around them for further emphasis, and then even darker boxes to hopefully help you see where the occupied space is. So 2 units were delineated because there was evidence of contemporary Cisco reproduction in these 3 disjunct areas, but only evidence for reproductive isolation between the Bay of Quinte and the Chameau Bay area, as well as a separate disjunct area along the southern shore there that includes Little Sodus Bay, and Irondequoit Bay. And again, just to highlight one example of the many studies that was used to inform the delineation of occupied spatial units, here we have 2 figures from a telemetry study done by Alex Gatch et al. So they collected Cisco in the Chameau Bay region, so this area here on the left figure. They put acoustic tags in these fish and let them go. All of the colored dots on that leftmost figure show where the acoustic receivers are in the lake that can detect these Cisco. And then on the right figure we have results from a network analysis just showing where Cisco moves during the spawning season. And this is specifically male Cisco. And we see during the spawning season, Cisco moved from different regions of the lake all back to the Chameau Bay region. So this indicated to the expert panel that there was evidence of site fidelity for reproduction, and as a result, this and other data contributed to the idea that there might be some reproductive isolation going on, and thus supported the delineation of multiple spatial units. Oh, yeah, so there's on the right, the place where they all went back to. And then finally, we have this really colorful figure. So this is the results of the Bloater spatial unit delineation. Again, we have black boundaries showing the, or black lines, excuse me, showing the boundaries of the single Lake Ontario unoccupied spatial unit that was delineated. We have an unoccupied unit here because there was no evidence of contemporary bloater reproduction. and yeah, no evidence of reproductive isolation, which would be required to delineate multiple units. And just like in the previous figures, we have this really beautiful historical reproductive habitat suitability model indicating where historically there was likely high quality habitat, so shown by the warmer colors, and lower quality habitat shown by the cooler colors. This bloater spatial unit's a little bit different from the Cisco in that the expert panel chose a depth range of 30 to 150 meters to show or reflect the different spawning habitats used by this taxon. Alright, so just to wrap things up, I know it's almost time for a break, so we'll keep this short and sweet. So in summary, we delineated spatial units for Lake Ontario, Bloater, and Cisco. These describe both the historical and contemporary use of spawning habitat by these species. So the left figure is just a simplified figure showing the location of the Cisco spatial units with the red shading indicating the unoccupied unit, and the green and magenta, I guess I'll say, colors showing the locations of the occupied units. On the right, we have the single unoccupied bloater spatial unit. And I would encourage you to think of these spatial units as hypotheses that are based upon the best available data. These spatial units can be revised if new information becomes available. And so the hope is that this work will inform restoration activities throughout the Great Lakes Basin, specifically in Lake Ontario in this case. There we go. So this was just the first step of this larger restoration framework. Follow-on steps are already using our outputs to inform their work. For example, the population viability analysis that Brian also mentioned in his talk, as well as threats assessments, are using the spatial scale determined by this spatial unit step to inform their work. And then also I hope this just gives you a general idea of what this process is like and what the outputs are. There's a lot more detail that I'd be happy to chat with folks about, other types of outputs. You can also, again, check out the website shown at the bottom of this slide if you want to find out more information, or just, yeah, flag me down sometime. I'd be happy to chat. Thanks.